The short story that I'm going to read is by Tingle. He's a member of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, and he's an award-winning author. The short story was published in a collection of short stories called Flying Lessons and Other Stories. It's an incredible collection of short stories. It has some of your favorite authors in it, like Kwame Alexander and Walter Dean Myers. I hope you love the short story. If you do, you should totally check out the collection. We have a copy in our Robert Eagle Staff Library. So here it is, Choctaw Bigfoot, Midnight in the Mountains by Tim Tingle. Blame my Uncle Kenneth. Everybody else does. Saturday afternoon, sitting under the trees in the backyard of Mau Mau, my Choctaw grandmother, the family was gathered for a weekly Saturday meal. Dozens of cousins and aunts and uncles and everybody kin to us. Barbecue cooked on the grill, beef and chicken and fat sausage links, my favorite. You know better than to listen to anything that man says, said my mother, sliding the glass patio door open and hollering loud enough for everybody to hear. My little cousin Cindy had just run in the house, screaming about some swamp creature from Mississippi. But Uncle Kenneth said, I don't care what your Uncle Kenneth says, now or 20 years from now. Uncle Kenneth sat on a chair by the fish pond with his hand resting on his chest. He was pretending to be asleep, but nobody bought it. As soon as Mom stepped inside to check on her pot of beans, Kenneth smiled and waved a finger at me. The other grown-ups looked at each other and shook their heads. That's when you really know you're surrounded by family. Nobody has to say a word. They just look at each other, and you know what they're thinking. I sauntered across the yard like I was searching for fallen pecans on the ground. When I reached Uncle Kenneth, I sat down by his chair and wrapped my arm around my knees. You know, your mother is a smart lady, Uncle Kenneth said. I looked up at him and waited. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked to the house and back at me told me, but she doesn't know everything. He didn't say it, he Choctaw said it. We're Choctaws, and we have our own ways, trust me. I laughed and nodded a Choctaw yes. So I already told you about the popoli, said those Choctaw little people, Uncle Kenneth said, and you know to not trust them. They aren't going to hurt anyone, no broken arms or sliced off fingers. That's not what they're about. They're funny, aren't they, Uncle Kenneth? That's right, Turtle Kid, he said. The Bopoli like to play jokes, and they can be invisible when they want to. So they're really good at joke playing. You don't mind me calling you Turtle Kid, do you? No, I like that name. Good, that'll be your Choctaw name for now. So anyway, the Bopoli were following a family down the road. They might have been driving a wagon pulled by horses, or maybe a car, I can't remember. I think it was a car, because it happened last year, I said. And it was in those Oklahoma Kiamashi Mountains, and it was almost midnight. You know this story. No, sorry, I said, zipping my fingers across my mouth, the Choctaw sign for I'll shut up. Okay, then, but it was last year. It was in the Kiamashi Mountains, and it was near midnight, so the night creatures were prowling. The driver, Mr. Chukma, pulled to the side of the road. Chukma pulled to the side of the road. He spotted a clearing under the trees and thought it would be a good place to spend the night. He stepped from the car, getting ready to open the door for his wife and wake up his 3 kids. That's when he heard it. I wanted so bad to ask, heard what? But I had already zipped my mouth shut. Instead, I leaned forward. Yes, Uncle Kenneth whispered, looking around the yard and making sure nobody else heard what he was about to say. That's when he heard it. I nodded slowly. Pow! He hollered, slapping his hands together. I fell over backward, and everyone within a mile laughed so loud my mother stuck her head through the back door again. Don't say I didn't warn you, she said. More laughter. Pay no attention to them, Turtle Kid, said my dear uncle. I want this to be a story you'll never forget. I sat up and said quietly, You don't have to worry about that. Achukma, good. Now, where was I? Oh, so Mr. Chukma heard the pow noise and jumped back in his car. He pulled his wife close to him and told his kids to get down on the floorboard and stay quiet. They didn't have long to wait. Mr. Chukma was leaning over the seat and assuring his kids that everything was going to be all right. So he had his back turned to the front windshield. Mrs. Chukma tapped him softly on the shoulder and whispered, "You need to look." Mr. Chukma was about to ask, "What is it?" But he didn't get a chance. He heard a growl, and so loud the kids screamed, and Mrs. Chukma screamed, and finally Mr. Chukma himself screamed. Nolusha Chito, the big, hairy man of Choctaw country, stood right in front of the car. Oh no, that's right, Turtle Kid, the big, hairy man, Nolusha Chito. That's what we Choctaws call him. He circled the car, waving a log so big no human could have carried it. But he swung it back and forth from his shoulder to his palm, slapping it like it was a foot-long ruler, like you have in school. By now, dozens of cousins had scooted around me, sprawled about on the ground and listening. Uncle Kenneth took a long, deep breath. And when he leaned forward again, the world changed. No longer were we in the backyard of Pasadena, Texas, the good backyard of my Choctaw grandmother. No, we were in the dark, deep woods of the Oklahoma Kiamachi Mountains, clinging to each other and praying that the Choctaw Bigfoot, the Nolusha Chito, would please go away. Now, I'm not going to tell you he smashed the hood of that car so hard he cracked the engine block and they couldn't drive away, but that's what happened. And when he finished with the hood, he flung the log at the windshield and the glass went shattering everywhere. "Oh no!" shouted dozens of cousins. Now, I'm not going to tell you Chukma and his family lost fingers and eyeballs and noses and ears with all that glass flying about, because that's not what happened. No, they had old Choctaw blankets wrapped around them, so they were safe. Well, not entirely safe. Mr. Chukma flung open his door, and Mrs. Chukma dragged the three kids out of the car, and just in time. Nolusha Chito jumped on and smashed the hood and pounded the roof of the car with his log. The Chukmas fled to the woods and hid behind a big boulder. They wrapped one big blanket over themselves and shook and shivered under it. Nolusha Chito climbed from the car and looked for the Chukmas. Didn't he? I asked. I was lying on the ground now with my face buried in the green grass. I whispered so softly, not a single blade of grass moved. "Yes, he did," said Uncle Kenneth. "He ran across the road and struck everything in his way. He knocked down a tree where a mountain lion slept, but even the mountain lion didn't want to fight Nolusha Chito, not at midnight, so he leapt to the ground and ran away." Then everything grew quiet. Real quiet, strange and quiet, like you never know living in the city. Nothing moved, no birds, not even crickets chirping, nothing. Nolusha Chito had scared every living thing in those woods, and he liked it. He knew that when the Chukmas moved, even a tiny little step, he'd hear him. So he sat down, pulled out a corn cob, and ate a few bites. Uncle Kenneth turned to me and asked, "I bet you thought I forgot all about the Bopoli." I shook my head, no, then lowered my chin to my chest and waited. Like the Chukmas, we all waited. Yes, those Bopoli, the Choctaw little people, they always seem to show up when they're least expected. And who's going to be looking for funny Bopoli when Nolusha Chito is smashing cars and trees and everything in sight? But anyways, they floated above the tree he leaned against. Floated? I asked. Oh yes, Turtle Kid. They can appear and disappear and time travel and do anything they want to. Those Bopoli, they floated above him and started making chirping sounds like little birdies. And oh, did that make Nolusha Chito mad? He threw his corn cob at the birdies, but they kept on chirping. So he climbed the tree, dragging his log behind him. Halfway up the tree, 30 feet high, the chirping stopped. He grunted a few times and looked up and down and all around. The popoli started chirping again on the end of the limb. Now Nalusho Chito, I don't care what they tell you, is not no idiot. No, he isn't. He knew not to climb out on that limb, heavy as he was, but he did scoot a few feet away from the trunk, and he did stretch his log out to the end of the limb. Then he stood up, careful not to lose his balance and fall, and slowly lifted the log over his head, ready to smash those chirpy birdies. That's when they did it. The popoli, they started chirping louder than ever. From the other end of the limb, the trunk side, and Nalusho Chito was so mad he turned around and smashed the limb he was standing on. Now, I'm going to tell you he fell 40 feet to the ground and knocked himself out, and the Chukmas heard it all and slept peacefully till morning, when they hitched a ride to town and lived happily ever after. Because that's not what happened, is it, Uncle Kenneth? I asked. No, Turtle Kid. It's never that simple. Not when the popoli are involved. What happened? Remember I said the Chukmas covered themselves with a Choctaw blanket. Well, Mrs. Chukma always carried a few spare blankets in the trunk of the car, and with the car smashed into smithereens, the trunk flew open. The popolis spotted the extra blankets, and while one popoli was chirping like a bird, the others hurried across the road and grabbed a beautiful blue Choctaw blanket. They flew to the base of the tree and stretched it wide like a trampoline. We all, myself and dozens of cousins, leaned back and raised our eyebrows in disbelief, like, okay, never gonna happen. Nalusho Chito had to weigh at least 1,000 pounds, and a few little people could never catch him and bounce him around like a kid on a trampoline. I know what you're thinking, Uncle Kenneth said. You're thinking, how could they cross the road without a crossing guard? Okay, I'm gonna stop there, and I'll pick it back up in just a second.